The acrid stench of smoke clung to the air, drifting across the lake at dawn. Sirens echoed, red lights flashing against calm water. Neighbors whispered, staring at the woman who had called the cops on a house she didn't even own. She thought she was protecting her HOA community. She thought she'd exposed a defiant outsider. What she didn't realize was that the cabin she was targeting belonged to the one man she could never control, because the very person she accused of trespassing was, in fact, her landlord. And this so-called Queen of the Lake? She was about to watch her empire collapse. What happens when a self-proclaimed HOA tyrant discovers she's been living on borrowed land? The lakefront community of Clearwater Shores looked idyllic. Glassy waters reflecting pine trees, white picket fences hugging the winding roads, and houses valued in the millions. But beneath that polished surface, a battle was brewing between old land rights and modern HOA power. Decades earlier, the land had been owned by a single family who never sold their mineral and water rights. Instead, they leased portions of shoreline to developers. Over time, those leases morphed into luxury cabins and lake homes, but the ownership of the valley remained firmly in the landlord's hands. The HOA didn't like it. They wanted control. Control over fences, mailboxes, even the shade of blue on a neighbor's shutters. To them, the landowner was a nuisance, someone standing in the way of total dominance. And leading their crusade was a woman named Marlene Carter, Clearwater's self-appointed HOA president. Mid-50s, sharp bob haircut, always in pastel athleisure and oversized sunglasses. She had the smug smile of someone who believed rules were weapons, not protections. She lived for fines, citations, and intimidation. To her, the HOA wasn't about community. It was about power. But the cabins by the lake were different. The HOA had no authority there. They couldn't enforce dues, couldn't control building codes, couldn't even dictate landscaping. Yet Marlene couldn't stand the idea that a handful of residents, her neighbors, lived beyond her reach. That's where the fight began. But Marlene didn't just pick a fight with stubborn tenants. She picked a fight with the one man who owned the ground beneath her own $1 million house. His name was Thomas Hale, widower, former federal judge, a man who traded the courtroom's fluorescent lights for quiet evenings on his lakeside property. Hale was calm, deliberate, and sharper than anyone gave him credit for. After his wife passed, he devoted his time to restoring the old family land, maintaining the cabins, protecting the wildlife, and quietly renting to families who couldn't otherwise afford lake access. To his tenants, he was a kind landlord who showed up with firewood in winter and waived rent when medical bills piled high. To Marlene, though, he was an enemy. She saw his cabins as unregulated blight, an insult to her carefully curated vision of Clearwater Shores. She wanted them gone. When Hale refused to join her HOA, Marlene escalated. She declared the cabins illegal dwellings, cited noise violations, and even sent HOA patrols to drive slowly past at night with floodlights. But she had no legal authority, and Thomas knew it. Still, grief had made him quiet. He let her bark and posture, preferring solitude over confrontation. That silence only emboldened her further. It all came to a head one summer night, when she called the sheriff, claiming an outsider was trespassing in a cabin on lakefront property. The deputies arrived, sirens blazing, neighbors gathering to watch the scene. Marlene pointed at the cabin, demanding the man inside be removed. What she didn't know, the trespasser was Thomas himself, the very landlord who owned her property title. The moment he stepped outside, the ground shifted. The HOA queen had just accused her landlord of breaking into his own home. The confrontation was cinematic. Marlene stood tall, sunglasses glinting under flashing lights, explaining to deputies how this man had refused to comply with HOA regulations. Her words dripped with authority, until Thomas calmly handed the officers a folder. Inside, original deeds dating back 70 years. Proof that his family still owned every acre of shoreline. Proof that the HOA had no jurisdiction over his cabins. Proof that Marlene's authority stopped at her white picket fence. The deputies glanced between the documents and Marlene. Her confident posture faltered, but instead of backing down, she doubled down. She accused Thomas of forging records. She accused him of harassment. She even tried to fine him on the spot for unauthorized fencing. The deputies refused. They knew the law, and with Thomas's papers in hand, the truth was undeniable. But Marlene wasn't finished. Humiliated in front of her neighbors, she escalated the war. Certified letters arrived daily, each demanding Thomas submit to HOA governance. She rallied board members, plastering notices on cabin doors. She spread rumors that Thomas was a squatter exploiting loopholes. What she didn't know was that every move she made was being documented. Every threat, every letter, every unlawful fine. Thomas began quietly building his case. He pulled tax records, proving the HOA had overcharged dozens of residents. He unearthed embezzlement trails, funds siphoned into shell accounts controlled by Marlene's relatives. And when neighbors learned the truth, they began turning on her. The HOA had fined a widow for leaving a wind chime on her porch. They'd penalized a veteran for planting a flagpole without permission. They'd driven families out with bogus liens. Now those families had a champion, Thomas Hale, the man Marlene thought she could intimidate. What Marlene didn't realize was that the very community she'd been terrorizing was about to unite behind the landlord she tried to destroy. Word spread like wildfire. The man Marlene had called a trespasser was the landowner, her landowner. Neighbors whispered at HOA meetings. Some quietly apologized to Thomas. Others began handing him their violation letters, begging him to fight back. Thomas filed formal complaints with the county. He revealed the HOA had no legal jurisdiction over large portions of the lake. He exposed how fines were fabricated, bylaws never properly adopted, and enforcement carried out without due process. And then came the smoking gun. Bank statements showing $180,000 missing from HOA funds. Marlene had been using association money to remodel her own home, claiming the expenses were for community safety upgrades. At the next board meeting, Thomas attended, not as a neighbor, but as the legal owner of the land. He stood before the crowd, papers in hand, and laid out the evidence. Fraud, embezzlement, abuse of authority. Neighbors gasped. Marlene's face flushed crimson. She accused him of lying, but the documents spoke louder than her denials. The sheriff's department opened a formal investigation. Local news picked up the story. HOA president accused of targeting landlord. Camera crews filmed as residents protested outside the HOA office, chanting for Marlene's resignation. Her empire was crumbling. She lashed out, threatening lawsuits, slandering Thomas, even trying to bribe inspectors to condemn the cabins. But every move only tightened the noose. And through it all, Thomas remained calm, deliberate, and patient, the way a judge dismantles a guilty defendant, piece by piece. Marlene thought she could break him with harassment. Instead, she was about to watch her own empire collapse in front of the neighbors she'd once ruled. It happened at dawn, the morning of the HOA's emergency hearing. Marlene strutted in, expecting control, expecting fear. Instead, she walked into a packed room, neighbors armed with documents, reporters with cameras rolling, and deputies standing by with warrants. Thomas waited at the front silent, as the county investigator read the charges aloud. Fraud, misuse of funds, harassment, illegal fines. The air was electric. Every family Marlene had wronged sat watching. The widow fined for her wind chime. The veteran humiliated for flying his flag. Tenants forced to sell under crushing, bogus penalties. Marlene tried to speak, her voice shaking, but every word was drowned by gasps and whispered outrage. When she turned toward Thomas, she saw not just a landlord, but the very man who now controlled the deed to her home. Because during the investigation, one final truth had surfaced. Marlene didn't actually own her property. Her house, her manicured lawn, her $1 million view, all of it sat on land still under Thomas Hale's ownership. Her mortgage? Tied to a lease that could be revoked. The room fell silent as Thomas revealed it. The so-called HOA queen wasn't just losing her power. She was about to lose the very house she lived in. Her empire collapsed in a single morning. Papers served, accounts frozen, neighbors cheering as deputies escorted her out in handcuffs. She thought she ruled the lake, but she never realized the lake belonged to him. Clearwater shores changed overnight. Without Marlene's iron grip, the HOA dissolved under state oversight. Residents voted to replace it with a simple neighborhood association, voluntary, transparent, accountable. Families who had been driven out returned for the first time in years, welcomed back by neighbors who finally understood the cost of silence. The cabins, once targeted as illegal blight, became symbols of freedom. Families fished, children played, and the lake was no longer shadowed by fear. As for Thomas Hale, he rebuilt not just his land, but his community. He opened the cabins for veterans, widows, and families struggling under HOA tyranny elsewhere, giving them refuge by the lake. His quiet strength became legend. And Marlene, convicted of fraud and stripped of her title, she lost the very home she tried to protect. The house was repossessed under her failed lease. The Queen of Clearwater had been dethroned by the landlord she thought she could destroy. For neighbors, it was more than justice. It was a warning that power without accountability breeds corruption, and silence only feeds the predator. And for those who watched it unfold, one haunting question remained. What would you do if the person calling the cops on you was living in your house all along? Have you ever fought an HOA tyrant? Share your story in the comments. Your voice might save someone else's home. And subscribe for more true stories where suburban power meets its downfall.